Hey everybody, welcome back to Horror Trans. I am Stephanie Bree. I am a transgender woman and I talk about all things horror. Today I'm continuing my Horror Icons series and we're tackling Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I'm working my way through the filmmakers before I get into the horror icons, like the characters and the production companies and things of that sort. Those are coming, and this is the last filmmaker I wanted to do, not all together, but before I jump into characters. And I wanted to have some distance between Wes Craven and Freddy Krueger because I didn't want to. I am obsessed with A Nightmare on Elm Street, but I don't want this channel to be all about A Nightmare on Elm Street because not everybody's a fan of Freddy Krueger. So, Alfred Hitchcock. As I've previously stated multiple times in other places, I studied film in school. I went to college with the intention of becoming a filmmaker myself. So I majored in journalism and I minored in theater because my school didn't have a technically pure film school curriculum, but it did offer film classes, film studies, theater studies, scripts, writing, etc. So I was able to piece together enough of an education to get what I found to be a satisfying film student curriculum. And as a film student, you absolutely study Alfred Hitchcock. As a horror fan, I am quite familiar with the impact Alfred Hitchcock had on the development of the horror genre and some subsequent subgenres, including the slasher subgenre, which his film Psycho is one of the earliest proto-slashers. It's one of the earliest examples of a movie that introduces some of the slasher tropes. It does have a final girl, it has the killer's POV, it has a serial killer who stabs people to death, etc. So it's almost a slasher, but not quite. Well, I've already talked about this movie, but let's talk about Alfred Hitchcock as a filmmaker. Alfred Hitchcock has been making, I shouldn't say was making, he's dead now. He's been dead for a long time. Alfred Hitchcock got his start making movies in the 1920s, in the silent era. So Alfred Hitchcock is famous for being an artistic director, a visual director. Now, we're not going to get into the problematic aspects of Alfred Hitchcock, like his misogyny, his homophobia, or the way he mistreated actors. Those are topics for another day. I bring them up because that is a topic I want to get into, but I want to get into that when I do problematic film creators, and that's going to be a whole video for another day, and that won't be a horror icons, that'll be something else. And that might not be on this channel, I don't know. But that's a video I'm working on. I don't have a script, but I have an outline and some bullet points. So I'm working on it, but that's coming down the road. And yes, Alfred Hitchcock is on that list, right next door to H.P. Lovecraft, who is also on that list, because he's problematic in his own ways. But we're not here to talk about his problematic aspects. We're just here to talk about his impact on film as a horror icon. Now, I am not going to pick apart the Alfred Hitchcock filmography because the motherfucker made, Jesus Christ, so goddamn many movies and TV show episodes and whatnot. Too fucking much for me to sit here and get into. There's absolutely no way. This would be a 3-hour video if I was going to sit here and break apart every fucking thing he's done. I will do individual reviews of his movies that I feel are in the horror family, which I've already done Psycho, which is absolutely in the horror family. But I'm not going to talk about his film career as a whole because it's pretty broad. He wasn't a horror filmmaker. He was a artistic filmmaker. He was an auteur. He saw films as art, and he went out of his way to prove film was art. He went out of his way to prove that. And I think he did a damn good job making a strong case that film is art. Or at the very least, is an artistic medium that can be used for artistic expression. At the very least. Not to say all film is art, but the medium itself is an artistic medium. So, that being said, I do want to talk about he's classified not as the master of horror. Obviously, that's Stephen King we talked about last week. He's classified as the master of suspense. His movies, by and large, more often than not, fall under the suspense thriller category. Now, I know thriller is one of those words that some horror fans are allergic to because they have this opinion that thriller is misused or misapplied to horror movies that people want to enjoy, non-horror fans want to enjoy and still feel comfortable with. And to an extent, that maybe does happen, and I will bring that up as I review examples of that when I do. And I have a topic video that I'm going to do on my primary channel talking about our thrillers horror, and I'm going to get into it. And I have, like I said, the bullet points of that already sketched out, so that video is coming. So definitely check that. You'll definitely want to check that out when it publishes. But for the meantime, let's just say that Alfred Hitchcock movies are absolutely suspense thrillers. And suspense being the key word. He is the master of suspense, and his movies are absolutely suspenseful. Now, some of them are scarier than others. Some of them are more psychological than others. And some of them are more artistic than others. Some of them are pulp, although his movies are more artistic than pulp. But let's be real, some of them are pulp. And so, as a filmmaker, his impact on horror is making a lot of suspenseful thrillers in the early days of cinema and before the horror renaissance of the 70s and 80s. The golden age of horror, as I call it. And so, he influenced future horror filmmakers. That's his impact on horror. Now, I'm not going to pull out examples of his work and say this is horror, this isn't horror. I'm going to talk about two examples that I do classify as horror. I've already talked about Psycho. I've already done a review of Psycho on this channel. Go check it out, please. I absolutely do consider Psycho a horror movie, or at least a proto-slasher. It is a horror movie. It's a early horror movie, late 60s, horror movie, just before the Renaissance or the Golden Age. So this movie helped broaden the definition of horror, because before this period, horror was monster movies and sci-fi movies. Like the Universal monsters, King Kong, Godzilla, The Thing from Another World, etc. Up to this point, that was what people thought of when they said the word horror movie. Now, there is another subgenre of the suspense thriller that was popular during Alfred Hitchcock's time. Some of his movies may or may not fall under, and that is film noir. I do enjoy film noir. Absolutely. Absolutely do. But I don't consider that horror necessarily. I do consider noir in the horror family, but I consider it like a distant cousin, twice removed. Not necessarily. I consider noir a family member you're going to see at the family reunion, but you're not going to see it like Uncle Bob's Wedding. Let's put it that way. suspense thrillers, who will also be at the family reunion, will be at Uncle Bob's wedding. They're closer to the family. They're closer. They're like second cousins, not necessarily twice. They're not distant cousins. They're like second cousins. They're like cousins you know by name, and you don't have to be reminded who they are every time you see them. And that's the kind of movies Alfred Hitchcock made. The other movie Alfred Hitchcock made, and he did others besides these two, but I'm only talking about these two in this video. The other movie he made that I strongly feel is horror, or at least at the time would have been classified as horror, is The Birds. And I do have The Birds on DVD. Spoilers. I have a lot of Alfred Hitchcock movies on DVD. Not all of them are horror, and not all of them am I going to recommend on this channel. That's another topic for another day. Now, the reason I consider The Birds horror is because, one, it's a creature feature, and I do consider creature features horror. Two, it's scary in its own respects, and it is violent, and people die, and it's intended to shock and terrify you. That's its intent. And so, to that end, yeah, this is horror. You know. Beyond that, the only other thing I will say about Alfred Hitchcock is, even before I went to college to study filmmaking, I was already a fan of Alfred Hitchcock. I had already seen dozens of his movies. And one of the reasons I wanted to become a filmmaker in the first place is because I'm a fan of Alfred Hitchcock's style, his visual style, his storytelling style. And so he had an influence on me, not just as an aspiring filmmaker, but also as a writer and as a horror fan, and as a person as well. So he definitely influenced me as well. So I love to talk about Alfred Hitchcock. So that's really all I can say in this video. There's nothing else I can say without either repeating myself or getting into the weeds, which I want to stay out of. You know, so there you go. Alfred Hitchcock, horror icon.